Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest in JPND, and thank you for your interest in this rapid action call. I'm one of the JPND program managers, and I'm here to tell you about it. I'm here with my colleague Steve Meader, who will keep a lookout for your emails. Now, we've set up this webinar to run through the details of the call and to answer any questions that you may have. So forgive me if I labour a few points that some of you know already. The webinar is going to remain on the JPND website until the call closure date, and that is the 16th of June. Next slide.
Slides?
Yeah. Okay, hopefully you will now be seeing the slides. Can you put it just, yes, thank you. So you're probably familiar with the JPND website because after all you're here, but if you want to get to the pages about the call, you need to click on major activities from the home page. And I draw your attention in particular to the frequently asked questions. I'm trying to advance the slides, it's not working.
Down.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So here's some screenshots of what I was talking about. Okay, so today this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to give you some context, talk about the purpose of the call, outline the challenges that our action group identified, then talk about the mechanism, the working groups, give some details and give you an example, hopefully bring that into frame. I'll then switch and talk about the review process and how we'll allocate funding, then go on to just run through the assessment criteria and recap the timetable. After that, we'll use the remainder of the webinar to try and address your questions. We've had a few questions in already, which I've loaded up onto the slides, but if you have further questions, please send them in now, and Steve will organise them so that I can add them onto the end of the stack. As mentioned, the webinar will remain open for you to replay after today, and of course the email address for contact for this particular call will stay open for the remainder of the call and probably throughout the lifetime of the call if you need to get in touch with us and you have any questions. So JPND, just a bit of context setting, forgive me if you know this already, but JPND is the largest global research initiative aiming to tackle the challenge of neurodegenerative diseases. Currently it involves 28 countries and it covers a range of neurodegenerative diseases from basic science, range of neurodegenerative diseases, those that are associated with aging that is, and it goes from basic science through to health and social care. What's important about JPND is that JPND is the joint program and the ideas are developed by the community for use by the community. So JPND has a research strategy. It was published in 2012, and this basically focuses on areas where no single country can do it all. It identifies common research goals that would benefit from joint action between countries in order, of course, to accelerate progress in neurodegenerative disease research. There's a side effect as well, of course, that national strategies can benefit. The idea is to have alignment right across Europe. So following the publication of the research strategy, JPND has been engaged in two sorts of activities. The first broad activity has been to launch a series of calls for proposals in areas where it's quite obvious what the immediate actions needed. And there's a second set of areas, and this call is one of those areas where actually further thinking is needed before we can begin to call for proposals to move the field forward. Other examples would be research sort of animal and cell models or on palliative care. So to develop the thinking for this call, JPND set up an action group which met actually by email and by phone conferencing to consider the issues around longitudinal cohort studies. There was a perception which turned out to be right, actually. There are a lot of cohort studies across Europe, but there's been no effort to pull them all together and to realise what is there and to pull together and see what could be done by aligning the work in each of them. So the conclusion of the action group was that cohort studies offer a major and largely untapped potential for research synergy. To state the obvious, if you can link cohorts, you get increased sample size and increased power to look at interactions. So the report includes in a list, which you can find in Annex 3 of the report, of 171 cohorts in all, and these cover mostly longitudinal population cohort studies, but we also looked at major disease-specific and non-European studies. So plenty of opportunity, but of course there are methodological challenges to overcome. And this is where more thinking is needed, and this is why we need to have the call. So the call is asking researchers to form working groups to identify realistic and achievable solutions and to provide guideworks and frameworks for best practice. We want to bring basically the leading experts together, the people who have the experience, who are happy to work together in a working group environment, and to come up with recommendations that the community can accept. In other words, they have to be advice that makes sense to everybody, and also that the community can use. We want these recommendations to have a very wide impact. We want to guide future research across the national community and the international community, and across both academic and commercial sectors. I should perhaps mention that we have in mind to issue a full call for proposals that we may tell you about towards the end of this year, with a deadline next year. Nothing certain as yet, but almost certainly we will have a call in the area of longitudinal cohort studies. So any work that's done through this current call will help inform people applying for that call. And of course, it goes without saying that being a member of the working group would help in that regard. So what were the challenges identified by the JPND Action Group? We have a list of 7 challenges that are listed in the call text, but that list isn't exclusive. If you come up with good ideas that need further thinking, and then by all means apply based around those ideas. Best probably to check with myself or Steve Meader, who's with me and will feed me some questions later, to check out that it really is within remit, and we'll give you advice before you submit. So the first area is how best to assess preclinical stages of neurodegenerative diseases. That's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, any other neurodegenerative disease associated with aging. We want to devise new tools, measures and approaches to enrich existing studies. That reminds me to mention that this call is about existing studies. It's not about setting up new studies, or it's not with a view to setting up new studies. So of course the advice could apply. More work's needed to develop standards and frameworks in the area of imaging, particularly multimodal imaging, where you're using a lot of different technologies at the same time. To reach consensus on definitions and methods to measure cognitive, functional and behavioural change. There are plenty of measures out there, but to get a common framework would help move the field forward. And on data handling, on how best to integrate and share data. To continue the list, to link existing cohorts, we need more work to select areas where there's a clear scientific advantage. Yes, you could have a grand plan to align every cohort in Europe. It doesn't make scientific sense. So which fields, which areas would particularly benefit? And then in order to be able to do that, is it realistic to achieve data pooling? Now, there won't be in many examples, but there may be cases where it's worth the effort to try to do that, and we need some guidance. How to exploit studies with clinical data linkage for prospective studies. In other words, almost repurpose a study that has clinical data linkage, and that will, of course, will include deciding what is best practice on data protection, on access, and so on. Also to exploit intervention studies of risk factors that were set up for an entirely different purpose. For example, to look at hypertension, cardiovascular symptoms are risk factors for neurodegenerative diseases too. If you add in outcomes that are attuned to neurodegeneration, you can enrich the power of the study. And finally, I've added in a topic suggestion that wasn't on the original list. It's an example of the sort of suggestion that you might make, which is once cohorts have reached the end of their natural lifetime, and perhaps they could be repurposed. Perhaps you could convert them to interventional prevention studies. And there's some experience across Europe in how to do this, but perhaps more thinking is needed to provide some guidance to the community. So, some details on the working groups. Who can be a member? Some of the questions that we've received have been about this. What we're looking for are members who are opinion leaders in neurodegenerative diseases research. It's entirely up to yourselves how you assemble the group and which expertises you bring in, but you must bring in a mix of expertise that makes sense to formulate the guidelines that you're going to propose to us. Remember, this is a JPND-wide activity. It's not just an activity based on the countries providing funding. It's JPND-wide, so the membership can come from any of the 28 JPND countries. And also, we do have a stipulation that there's a minimum of 3 countries. And it's also fine to include experts from right outside JPND, as long as they're internationally recognised experts and you can justify why they need to join the working group. Of course, you'll need to think about things like the fares needed, perhaps bring them across from, say, Canada, but that will need to be part of your planning from the funding that we give you. Another point to make is that we're going to need each group to have a coordinator. Now, that coordinator must be based within one of the 9 funding countries, is what we're calling sponsor countries. But that coordinator need not be the most senior expert in the working group. In fact, there might be some merit to having somebody who's perhaps a postdoc, a senior postdoc, because they may well have more time to dedicate to organising and delivering this project. There are no rules on this, it's entirely up to you, but I thought I'd like to mention that. So how will the working groups work? Well, as mentioned already, for the action group itself, in fact, you will interact through workshops and through various forms of communication like Skyping or email, whatever suits you, telephone conferences, and that is how you will throw in ideas into the ring and revise them and come up with ideas for coordination and best practice. You'll also get together to produce the report, which will be published on the JPND website. And what JPND would like to see is it can also be published in a scientific journal. What we have in mind is, if it's feasible, is to work with the JPND communications executive to have a series of side-by-side articles in a scientific journal, which might make sense. It's an idea at the moment, but something like that might be very nice. We want the work to start in September, and we want it to finish by March 2015, and that means that we need the reports by the end of March 2015, and the publication to take place in April 2015. Yes, one point that's come up in the questions: can you be a member of more than one working group? Well, the answer is yes, that's fine, but we don't suggest that you're a coordinator for more than one, just for the obvious pragmatic reasons. It would be a lot of work, and it's probably too much to do 2 at once. How often would you meet? Up to you. I'm going to show you an example in a little while, but basically we envisage that you'd have a workshop, face-to-face workshop at the beginning and one at the end of your process. I don't think I've mentioned already, you probably know, but it's 50,000 euros that we'll provide for a working group. That's loosely costed on 2 small workshops, web conferencing and publication costs. So the outcomes are report and publication of framework or guidelines. The guidelines could be around, for example, planning of future studies, the design of data sweeps, how to decide common standards or align measurements, or to identify or around areas, justification for areas that might benefit from alignment. I should say that we see there being value for the advice for smaller focus studies, as well as for larger collaborations. And also the advice should be useful not just for large collaborative studies, but also for national studies that may take place in JPND or other countries. I have a slide here to demonstrate how we see the working groups operating. I don't have a pointer, but if you bear with me, if you're on the left-hand side of the slide. So the first workshop, you'd get together face-to-face. you'd scope the process, you'd decide what work packages you needed and assemble subgroups to join those work packages. You might decide at that point, actually, you need some additional experts to join to plug a few gaps, and that would be fine. It's probably wise to allow for that in your costings. So the work packages will go away and meet. They'll come up with some advice, and then a final workshop might be convened where each work package presents their work, everybody discusses it, the work is integrated. Now at this point, you might like to build in a critique. You might like to assemble a draft report, and these reports, by the way, need not be long reports. We're thinking of short reports, and we'll send you some guidance on that later on. You might send it out to a reference group of independent experts who will critique what you put forward. They may be able to spot some gaps you've missed. They may have some ideas for tweaking what you've presented. And then after that, the coordinator will put the report together for publication and dissemination. This whole process, as you'll see from the bottom, would take 6 months. So I have an example here from a different European initiative, the Centres of Excellence in Neurodegeneration Initiative, which shows that this can in fact be done. This was work led by Professor Joanna Wardlaw at Edinburgh University, and it was a working group that was looking at standards for determining the vascular contribution to neurodegenerative diseases. It's particularly difficult to image small vessel disease, and this impairs clinical characterization and it impairs the ability to compare studies. So the goal was to create a consensus on the specifications for small vascular disease neuroimaging and to create standards for image acquisition, for analysis and reporting. And 35 international experts, larger than in our recommendation in this case, got together and they propose a standard. They did use a reference group, the idea that I suggested in the previous model. And the standard was not only published in Lancet Neurology, but has been adopted by the relevant communities, the International Stroke Genetics Consortium and the other societies. So hopefully that having a concrete example helps as you think about how you might put your working group together and what you might address. So I'll now switch to talk about how we'll assess your applications. We will assess the applications using a panel in a one-step process. The panel will be based on the JPND Scientific Advisory Board. The membership is on the JPND website, and the proposals will be selected in competition. And the main factors are the importance of the question you're asking, the quality of the working group, in other words, the mix of experts and their standing, and the potential for impact that any advice that you provide will have. So the panel will arrive at a rank order list, and then make recommendations to the funding agencies, and then the JPND sponsor group, the funding agencies, will meet following that to align the funding with the best proposals identified by the panel. So each funding agency will fund a single working group up to 50,000 euros, there may be some tweaking of the sum you request. If you haven't justified what you require well enough, you should probably be prepared for that, so it's important to take the time to justify what you need. Each proposal is a coordinator from one of the 9 sponsor countries, each to involve at least 3 of the JPND countries. When it comes to it, if we find we have a mismatch between funding agencies and the makeup of the groups that are the best proposals, we may be quite pragmatic. We may actually ask you to identify, we may actually suggest the expert or ask you to identify the expert from a sponsor country that's got unused funding. In that way, we would be able to fund 9 working groups. We wouldn't have funding unspent. If you have any questions about that, we'd be happy to answer that offline through emails. So these are the assessment criteria. You'll see that they're in the information that's provided on the website if you drill down. So the scientific fit to the call, the standing of the experts, the importance and timeliness of the ideas, the plans for dissemination, these must be robust, and the potential impact of outcomes for the field. it's worth thinking through that in some depth and writing it down. The form has been designed to mirror these assessment criteria, so it should be relatively easy to plan the proposal. And of course, the feasibility of the project plan, it needs to be realistic. So I've mentioned the information available. Broadly, this is the core text itself, the frequently asked questions and the application template, all on the JPND website. Submission again is by PDF, by email to the JPND working groups at head office, MRC, AC, UK email address that we're going to keep constant throughout this activity. And the web link is just for completeness put there. Okay. The sponsoring countries, here's a list. You can read it for yourself, so 9 countries in all. We've asked other countries to think about whether they might like to join in and said that up until June the 16th there's still the opportunity. And it could be the case that more than one funding agency from a single country might wish to sponsor. So, the timeline. We announced the call on 23rd of April. Submission date is the 16th of June. In late July, we'll be making the funding decisions and the funding allocation, so we'll be notifying you in August, and we expect the working groups to commence activities in September. Reports by March and guidance published by April 2015. I hope that's broadly covered the essence of it, and I'm now opening up for answering questions. I could start, should I start with one of the ones we had already? Yeah, I've got some that came in earlier. Sounds like a cookery competition. So the first question was, I would like to coordinate a working group, but I'm based in a country that isn't one of the 9 sponsors, so is it possible? And the answer is yes, of course. You just need to make sure that the coordinator does come from yeah. The answer is no, but you can still play a very active role in that group. We do need to have the coordinator from one of the 9 sponsors. You can probably tell by my hesitation that this is one of the issues that we debated. Another question, I'm interested, but how do I go about finding a working group to join? Well, it depends. At the moment, it's down to you, I think, to talk to your colleagues and collaborators to find out who else is thinking about applying for this call. Later on, though, nearer the deadline, we in the Secretariat should have a better idea of which groups are forming, and we might be able to put you in touch. But the best method is really word of mouth. I've heard of some myself on the grapevine that are likely to come in, and I expect it will be the same in your country. So this is called a rapid action call. How long is this initiative thought to last? Well, this specific call, this call for work around longitudinal cohort studies, is rapid action because we've just announced it and we'll have decisions by August. That's why it's rapid. And it's a one-off exercise. I guess we may choose to repeat it, but we certainly haven't decided that. And basically, it will be over by the deadline and the announcements that we make in the summer. However, JPND itself has a much longer lifetime, and you can expect a range of different activities coming from JPND. And I think I already mentioned that we may well launch a full call for proposals in this subject area later on. So what's the minimum number of countries or working groups necessary to join the consortium for presenting an application? What we advise is that there should be a minimum number of 3 and a maximum number of 20 countries. Number of working groups, well, we can fund up to 9 working groups at present unless some other sponsors join in. I think that's probably the answer to that one. How uniform should be the distribution of different disease representatives in a working group on large-scale data sets? I would bat that question back to you. It's for you to decide which diseases need to be represented. you know, for some areas of activity that I mentioned, it may benefit from having quite a niche disease alongside a very common disease. But I think it's up to you to decide. I think the next question is related, really. Would it be feasible to focus such a working group on one disease and work out recommendations that could successively be translated to other diseases? Yes, that would be one approach. It may be that actually in your working groups, if you think around one disease to start with, then you might realize quite quickly that the ideas wouldn't apply to other diseases, and you might need to develop some ideas in parallel. And the other part of this question was, or should the distribution of participants over different diseases be equal? There's entirely up to you. There's absolutely no need to come up with something that's uniform. You must pick the best fit of people to do the task that you have in front of you. What are you looking for in members of the working groups? This was in one of the earlier slides, but basically we're looking for people who are opinion leaders in their field, who have expertise that fits very nicely with the other members of the working group, so that between you, you're fit to answer the questions that you set for yourselves. I've already said that they need not all be senior members of the scientific community. For example, the coordinator could be somebody who's a senior postdoc, as opposed to a professor who's been in the field for many years. Can I be a member of more than one application? Again, as mentioned earlier, yes, you can, and it may make sense for you to be a member of more than one application, but we wouldn't suggest that you're a coordinator for more than one. What will happen if you get two very similar applications and they are both good? If they're both good, we may decide that it would make sense. By we, I mean on advice, of course, of the scientific panel. We may decide that it makes sense to merge, to form a larger working group, or to form the same working group with slightly different membership. We'll have a discussion about that during the panel meeting. We haven't made any hard-cut decisions yet. We're waiting to see what comes in. No hard-cut decisions about precisely, no rules about precisely what we'll fund. How will sponsors decide who funds which group? We'll be very pragmatic about it. We will look at the rank order list, we'll look at what's proposed, we'll see which countries are involved in which working group, and we may do a little bit of reshuffling to decide the sponsoring. Will the working group workshops have to be held in the sponsor's country? In principle, no. It would basically depend on the rules and regulations of the sponsoring funding agency. But you know, potentially the workshop could take place in Brussels, even if the working group is funded by the UK, for example, to use an own example. We would really like to invite a number of scientists outside JPND as part of our working group. Is that acceptable? Yes, it's more than acceptable. If actually the expertise that you need lies outside the JPND countries, then it makes sense to involve somebody from another country who happens to have a particular type of expertise. Another question that slightly repeats an earlier question, is there an ideal size for the working group? We just simply say it should have between up to 20 members, basically. We haven't decided what an ideal size would be. It may be that in particular areas you need fewer rather than more members. I simply can't answer that in more precisely. So that was the end of the questions that we had in advance. Yes, have the camera back, and I will take some questions that have come in by email since the webinar started. Just bear with us a moment while we load them up. Okay, so the first question is from University of Pisa. Dealing with this call on neurodegenerative diseases, are some forms of neurogenetic disorders such as spinal muscular atrophy or MELAS included? The exact scientific remit of JPND, we do list out the neurodegenerative diseases that are covered, which range from larger and smaller, commoner and less common neurodegenerative diseases. They need to be neurodegenerative diseases associated with aging. But I think we would take a broad view. If, for example, some of the work on the smaller neurogenetic disorders were part of a wider set of thinking, then that would be absolutely fine. If you'd like to discuss further with us when you've thought through what proposal you'd like to make, that would be absolutely fine. The next one. Okay, is there a way an interested individual scientist can express interest in joining a working group? Now, this is quite similar to that previous question, isn't it? Yes, well, you can certainly express interest. You are doing so now, actually, probably to quite a lot of people and to ourselves. And we'll keep a list of the people who've expressed an interest. I think we need to think further about how exactly we would catalogue that and how we would make it available to others who would. But basically, we're more than happy to put people in touch with each other who get in touch with us. I hope that's sufficient for now. Any more? Is that it? Is it? Okay then. Well, I'll sit here for a bit. And what time are we going to close? Is it 1:45?
It's at 1:45.
Yes. Well, I'll just wait for a while and see if any more proposals come in. We could possibly put the timeline up or something. It may be technically a bit difficult. Apologies for that. There's one thing actually you could address for us, and if you found this webinar useful, then can you let us know whether it's useful or whether in fact the written information was sufficient.
Does there to be any more questions coming in?
Okay. Well, we'll hang fire a little while longer. No.
No.
Well, I think in that case, probably thank you for attending and thank you for your interest, and we'll close this call.